December 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Snow drifts against the barbed wire fence. Inside a mess hall warmed by industrial heaters, a Japanese soldier sits frozen before a metal tray. On that tray, a hamburger patty thick as his fist, mashed potatoes drowning in butter, green beans, 2 slices of white bread, and a bottle of Coca-Cola beaded with condensation. More food than he'd seen in 6 months. More food than his family back in Osaka had seen in a year. He does not eat. His hands tremble. He has been taught since childhood that capture means death, that Americans are devils who torture prisoners, that the only honorable end for a Japanese soldier is to die fighting. This hamburger, he decides, must be his last meal before execution. But the execution never comes. The next morning, breakfast arrives. Rice, eggs, toast, coffee. At noon, lunch. At evening, dinner. Day after day, week after week, the meals keep coming. And slowly, something inside these men begins to break. Not their bodies, their beliefs. This is the story of how the United States won a secret war that had nothing to do with bombs or bullets. A war fought with hamburgers and hot showers. A war so psychologically devastating that the Japanese government tried to hide it for decades. Because the most dangerous thing America did to capture Japanese soldiers wasn't torture. It was treating them like human beings. To understand what happened in American POW camps, you must first understand what these men carried in their minds. Japanese soldiers didn't simply fear capture. They were taught that capture was impossible, that death was always the better choice. The indoctrination began in childhood. The imperial rescript to soldiers and sailors, issued by Emperor Meiji in 1882, became the foundational text of Japanese military culture. Every soldier memorized it. Every recruit recited it until the words became reflex. One passage stood above all others. Do not be taken prisoner alive. Do not suffer the shame of capture. This wasn't advice. It was an absolute command backed by the authority of a living God. The shame of capture extended beyond the individual soldier. If you were captured, your family would be disgraced. Your name would be stricken from village records. Your parents would be shunned. Your siblings would struggle to find work or marry. In a culture where honor and collective identity meant everything, capture was a fate worse than death. It was social annihilation. Military training reinforced these beliefs with methodical brutality. Officers beat recruits for minor infractions. Senior soldiers terrorized junior ones. The message was clear. This is kindness compared to what the enemy will do. Propaganda depicted Americans as subhuman monsters. Training films showed fake footage of Allied soldiers torturing prisoners, burning them alive, cutting off their limbs. Instructors told stories of POWs forced to drink gasoline, skinned alive, fed to dogs. Every story designed to ensure that Japanese soldiers would fight to the death rather than surrender. And it worked. In the early Pacific campaigns, surrender was virtually non-existent. During the Battle of Attu in May 1943, of the 2,900 Japanese defenders, only 28 were captured alive. The rest died fighting or committed suicide. At Tarawa in November 1943, only 17 prisoners were taken from a garrison of nearly 5,000 men. The few who were captured often tried to kill themselves afterward, biting through their own tongues, smashing their heads against walls, refusing food and water. Some succeeded. Those who failed faced a psychological torture worse than any physical abuse, the knowledge that they had violated the deepest principle of their existence. They had survived when they should have died. And now they would face the consequences. Guadalcanal, February 1943. Private First Class. Yasuo Kuwahara lies in a shell crater, his leg shattered by shrapnel from an American mortar. Blood pools beneath him. The sounds of battle have moved on. He has one grenade left. Standard procedure is clear. Pull the pin, hold it to your chest, die instantly. No capture, no shame. His hand closes around the grenade, but something stops him. Maybe it's the shock. Maybe it's the morphine from his own medical kit dulling his resolve. Maybe it's simple animal survival instinct overriding years of indoctrination. He doesn't pull the pin. Hours later, American Marines from the 2nd Division find him. Kuwahara expects to be shot immediately, or bayoneted, or dragged behind a truck. Instead, A corpsman kneels beside him, cuts away his blood-soaked trousers, and begins treating his wound. The American's hands are gentle. Professional. Kuwahara screams, not from pain, from confusion and terror. This cannot be real. Americans don't help Japanese soldiers, they torture them. Everyone knows this. But the corpsman keeps working. Sulfanilamide powder on the wound, pressure bandage, a shot of morphine. Within 30 minutes, Kuwahara is on a stretcher being carried to an aid station, still waiting for the torture to begin. This scene repeated itself thousands of times across the Pacific theater. Japanese soldiers, conditioned to expect barbarism, instead received immediate medical treatment. Men who'd lost limbs, suffered burns, taken bullets, all treated by the same medical protocols as American wounded. At field hospitals, captured Japanese soldiers lay in beds next to American GIs. The same nurses, the same doctors, the same antibiotics that were saving American lives were also saving theirs. For men who'd been taught that the enemy saw them as vermin, this was incomprehensible. The confusion only deepened during initial interrogation. Intelligence officers from the Military Intelligence Service Language School, many of them Japanese-American Nisei, would sit across from prisoners and ask questions, not scream them, not beat them out of them, ask them. Some prisoners refused to speak, still waiting for the beatings to start. But the beatings never came. Instead, interrogators offered cigarettes, water, sometimes even tea. They explained the Geneva Conventions in perfect Japanese. They showed documents proving that the International Red Cross monitored POW camps. And then came the thing that shattered reality most completely. The prisoners were asked if they needed anything. Medicine, letters to family, warmer clothes. One captured officer, Major Hideo Suzuki, later wrote about his first interrogation. I kept waiting for the mask to drop, for the kindness to reveal itself as a trick, but it never did. They treated me with more dignity than my own superior officers had shown me in 10 years of service. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. Every act of basic human decency was an assault on everything these men had been taught to believe. If Americans weren't monsters, then what had they been fighting for? If the enemy showed more humanity than your own command, what did that say about your cause? These questions would only intensify once they reached the camps themselves. The first thing that shocked Japanese POWs about American prison camps wasn't the food or the beds or the medical care. It was the lack of violence. In the Imperial Japanese Army, violence wasn't just common. It was institutional. Junior soldiers were routinely beaten by senior soldiers. Officers slapped subordinates for minor infractions. Ritualized brutality was considered essential to maintaining discipline and building warrior spirit. So when Japanese POWs arrived at camps like Camp McCoy in Wisconsin, Camp Livingston in Louisiana, or Camp Clarinda in Iowa, they expected the same system, except worse. Because if Japanese officers beat their own men, surely American guards would beat captured enemies. But the beatings never came. Guards didn't carry clubs. They didn't strike prisoners. When POWs violated minor rules, talking after lights out, not saluting officers, they faced disciplinary measures like loss of privileges or extra work duty, but no violence, no ritualized humiliation. To the prisoners, this was as alien as life on another planet. One former POW, Sergeant Koji Ariyoshi, later recalled, I kept waiting for the real camp to reveal itself. The camp where we would be beaten and starved. But weeks passed, then months, and it never happened. That was when I began to understand that everything we'd been told was a lie. The physical conditions of the camps reinforced this psychological shock. Barracks were heated in winter and ventilated in summer. Each prisoner had his own bunk with a mattress, sheets, and blankets. Communal bathrooms had hot running water and flush toilets. Many prisoners of war had never experienced these amenities even in civilian life. Private Tadashi Ono, captured at Saipan in July 1944, wrote in a diary that American guards later preserved, My family's house had a dirt floor and an outhouse. Here I have a wooden bed, electric lights, and hot showers. I am living better as a prisoner than my parents are living as free citizens. Then came the food. The U.S. Army followed strict regulations. POWs were to receive the same rations as American troops. This meant roughly 3,000 calories per day. Meat, vegetables, bread, fruit, dairy products, and coffee. Not rice and pickled radishes. Not watery soup and moldy bread. The same food American soldiers ate. At Camp McCoy, the first meal served to a group of newly arrived Japanese POWs in December 1944 included hamburgers, mashed potatoes, green beans, white bread with butter, and Coca-Cola. The camp commander, Colonel Robert Patterson, watched from across the mess hall as the prisoners stared at their trays in silence. Several men refused to eat. They were convinced it was poisoned or that it was a psychological trick, one good meal before the starvation began. Guard sergeants had to demonstrate that the food was safe by eating from the same serving dishes. Even then, some prisoners ate only small portions, unable to believe the meal was real. But the meals kept coming. 3 times a day, every day. Breakfast might be rice, scrambled eggs, toast, and coffee. Lunch could be beef stew, potatoes, carrots, and fruit. Dinner often featured pork chops, vegetables, bread, and dessert. The psychological impact was profound. These men knew their families back in Japan were starving. By late 1944, rice rations in Japanese cities had been cut to barely subsistence levels. Meat was almost non-existent. Children were developing malnutrition diseases. And here they were, prisoners of war, eating better than they'd ever eaten in their lives, better than their families, better than the civilians of the country they'd fought for. The cognitive dissonance was crushing. Some prisoners of war requested smaller portions, unable to bear the guilt. Others ate everything, then vomited from the psychological stress. A few refused food entirely, though camp doctors intervened if starvation became a medical risk. Medical care completed the psychological assault. Camp doctors treated prisoners with the same standards as American troops: antibiotics for infections, surgery for serious injuries, dental care, vision correction, even psychiatric counseling for men showing signs of severe mental distress. At Camp Livingston in Louisiana, a Japanese prisoner named Hiroshi Nakamura developed acute appendicitis in March 1945. An American Army surgeon performed the appendectomy. Nakamura received penicillin, still a relatively new wonder drug, to prevent infection. He recovered fully. After the war, Nakamura told his story to Japanese researchers. What haunted him wasn't the surgery or the hospitalization. It was the realization that if he'd become sick while serving in the Imperial Army, he would likely have been left to die. His own military had no penicillin. Field hospitals were overwhelmed and undersupplied, but the enemy had saved his life. This pattern repeated across every camp. Prisoners received medical treatment, adequate food, shelter, and basic human dignity. And with each day, the foundation of their beliefs cracked a little more. By mid-1945, American authorities recognized they had accidentally created a powerful weapon: information. Japanese POWs who'd been treated humanely became walking contradictions to everything their compatriots believed about the enemy. The Military Intelligence Service, working with psychological warfare units, developed a program that would exploit this, not through torture or coercion, through documentation. Prisoners were asked, never forced, but asked, to write letters that could be reproduced and distributed as propaganda leaflets over Japanese positions. These letters weren't scripts written by Americans. They were genuine accounts from prisoners of war describing their treatment, the food they ate, the medical care they received, the absence of torture. Thousands agreed to write these letters. Not because they were coerced, but because they were angry. Angry at the officers who'd lied to them. Angry at the system that had forced them to choose between death and dishonor. Angry that they'd been prepared to die for beliefs built on propaganda. One letter, written by Corporal Takeo Miyamoto and dropped over Luzon in the Philippines in February 1945, read, "I was told Americans would gouge out my eyes and cut off my fingers. Instead, they fixed my broken teeth and gave me 3 meals a day. I was told I would be tortured. Instead, I play baseball and watch movies. I was told surrender was death. Instead, surrender was life. You have been lied to just as I was lied to." These leaflets were printed by the millions and dropped over battlefields, airfields, and defensive positions. Japanese command tried to forbid soldiers from reading them. Officers threatened execution for anyone caught with Allied propaganda. But the leaflets kept falling from the sky and soldiers kept reading them. The impact was measurable. Surrender rates, which had been virtually zero in 1942 and 1943, began climbing in 1944. By the first half of 1945, they increased dramatically, not because Japanese soldiers were less brave or committed, but because some began to question whether death was truly the only honorable option. At Okinawa, the largest battle of the Pacific War, American forces captured approximately 7,400 Japanese military prisoners and 3,400 unarmed laborers. This seems small compared to the 100,000 Japanese troops who died, but it represented a revolution in Japanese military psychology. In previous battles, those 10,800 men would have fought to the death or committed suicide. Some surrenders were triggered directly by the leaflets. Private Masao Watanabe, captured on Okinawa in June 1945, later told interrogators that he'd found a propaganda leaflet showing photographs of Japanese POWs eating meals, playing sports, and receiving medical care. He'd hidden the leaflet in his boot. When his unit was cut off and facing annihilation, he convinced 3 other soldiers to surrender with him. But the real breaking point for many POWs came when they learned about the situation back home. In the camps, prisoners had access to newspapers and radio broadcasts. They heard about the firebombing of Tokyo in March 1945, which killed over 100,000 civilians. They learned about the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August. And they realized something devastating. While they were eating hamburgers in Wisconsin, their families were burning in Tokyo. While they slept in heated barracks in Louisiana, their cities were being reduced to ash. While they received medical care in Iowa, their countrymen were dying by the thousands. The guilt was overwhelming. Some prisoners fell into deep depression. Camp psychiatrists at several facilities reported increased suicide attempts and self-harm among POWs who learned about the destruction of their hometowns. But others experienced a different psychological shift. If the leadership that had promised them honor and glory was now presiding over the annihilation of their homeland, maybe that leadership had been wrong about everything. Maybe surrender hadn't been the shameful choice. Maybe it had been the smart choice. Maybe survival mattered more than ideology. When Japan announced its surrender on August 15, 1945, the reaction in American POW camps was mixed. Some prisoners celebrated, others wept. Many sat in stunned silence, trying to process that the empire they'd been willing to die for had ceased to exist. At Camp McCoy, the camp commander assembled all prisoners and played the radio broadcast of Emperor Hirohito's surrender announcement. The emperor's voice, recorded and broadcast for the first time in history, crackled through speakers. He spoke of enduring the unendurable and suffering the insufferable. Some prisoners dropped to their knees, others remained standing, faces blank with shock. One man reportedly laughed, a high, broken sound that dissolved into sobbing. The war was over. But for these men, another struggle was just beginning: the return home. Between late 1945 and early 1946, over 5,000 Japanese POWs held in the United States were repatriated to Japan. They boarded Liberty ships and returned to a homeland many barely recognized. Cities were burned, infrastructure was shattered. Millions were homeless, starvation was widespread, and they were coming home fat. The psychological and social complications of repatriation began before the ships even reached Japan. Former POWs were briefed by American officials about what to expect. They might face discrimination, hostility, or legal consequences. Japanese society, they were warned, might not welcome them back. The warnings were accurate. When the first repatriation ships docked at ports like Uraga and Hakata, the returning POWs faced immediate hostility. Civilians who'd endured starvation and firebombing stared at the well-fed prisoners with open disgust. Officials from the demobilization bureaus processed them with cold efficiency, barely concealing their contempt. Many former POWs tried to hide their treatment in American camps. When asked about their captivity, they gave vague answers. It was difficult. We survived. They didn't mention the hamburgers, the medical care, the movies, or the sports. To do so would have been to invite rage from people who'd lost everything, but some couldn't hide it. Their physical condition gave them away. In a country where millions were malnourished, former POWs often looked healthier than soldiers who'd served until the surrender. Their teeth had been fixed. Their wounds had healed properly. They didn't have the gaunt, hollow look of men who'd survived on inadequate rations. The resentment was immediate and intense. Tadashi Ono, the former private who'd written about his family's dirt floor house, returned to his village near Kyoto in December 1945. His parents were alive but gaunt, living in a damaged house with no heat. When Ono tried to explain that he'd been treated well in captivity, his father turned away in disgust. Ono later wrote, "My father said I should have died honorably instead of living as a pet of the enemy. He would not speak to me for 2 years. In his eyes, and the eyes of our village, I was not a survivor. I was a coward who'd chosen comfort over honor." The social stigma was systematic. Former POWs struggled to find employment. Companies refused to hire them. Families refused to let their daughters marry them. Local communities treated them as pariahs, men who'd broken the warrior code and lived in shame. Some former POWs responded by disappearing into Japan's chaos. Cities were filled with displaced people, making it possible to start over with a new identity. Others moved to different regions where their pasts were unknown. A few even changed their names. But the psychological burden remained. These men had experienced something that contradicted everything their culture had taught them. They'd been treated humanely by an enemy that was supposed to be barbaric. They'd been given dignity by a system that was supposed to dehumanize them. And they'd survived when honor demanded they die. The Japanese government actively suppressed information about POW treatment. Reports of American camps were classified. Official histories of the war minimized or ignored the subject entirely. Textbooks taught that Allied forces committed atrocities against prisoners while omitting any mention of humane treatment. This official silence served multiple purposes. It preserved the narrative of Allied barbarism that had justified the war. It avoided uncomfortable questions about why Japan had treated Allied POWs so brutally, with death rates exceeding 27%, while American treatment of Japanese prisoners followed international law. And it prevented the psychologically dangerous idea that surrender might have been rational from taking root in post-war Japanese consciousness. The silence lasted for decades. It wasn't until the 1980s and 1990s that Japanese historians and journalists began seriously investigating the experience of Japanese POWs in American camps. By then, many former prisoners were elderly or dead. Those who remained were often reluctant to discuss their experiences. The shame and social stigma had been internalized, but some did talk. In interviews conducted in the 1990s by researchers like Ulrich Strauss and historian Uemura Hideaki, former POWs described their captivity with complex emotions, gratitude mixed with guilt, relief mixed with shame, and almost universally, anger at the lies they'd been told. Koji Ariyoshi, the former sergeant who'd waited for the real camp to appear, gave an interview in 1993, shortly before his death. He said, "The Americans won the war with their bombs and their ships. But they defeated me with a hamburger and a clean bed. Everything I'd believed about honor and duty was shown to be propaganda. That was the most devastating weapon of all." The psychological impact of humane treatment extended beyond individual former prisoners. It raised fundamental questions about wartime propaganda, military indoctrination, and the nature of honor itself. If the enemy you'd been taught to hate with every fiber of your being turned out to be humane, what did that say about the authorities who'd taught you to hate? These questions became particularly relevant as Japan rebuilt and eventually became one of America's closest allies. The transformation required reconciling the wartime narrative of American barbarism with the post-war reality of American aid, democratic reforms, and economic partnership. For some former POWs, this reconciliation was impossible. They carried the psychological burden until death. For others, it became a source of dark irony. The enemy that was supposed to torture them had instead given them the best years of the war. The humane treatment of Japanese POWs in American camps wasn't accidental. It was the result of deliberate policy decisions made at the highest levels of the U.S. government and military. And while humanitarian concerns played a role, strategic calculation was equally important. The United States was a signatory to the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. International law required humane treatment, but Japan had signed but never ratified the treaty. Technically, the U.S. had no legal obligation to follow Geneva Convention standards for Japanese prisoners. President Franklin Roosevelt and the War Department chose to follow those standards anyway. There were multiple reasons, but one stands out: reciprocity. American prisoners were being held by Japan under horrific conditions. The death rate in Japanese POW camps exceeded 27%. Men were starved, beaten, worked to death, and executed. If the United States mistreated Japanese prisoners, it would give Japan justification to further brutalize American POWs. But if America treated Japanese prisoners humanely and documented that treatment, it created international pressure on Japan to improve conditions for Allied prisoners. The strategy had limited success. Japanese treatment of Allied POWs remained brutal throughout the war, but it did provide ammunition for diplomatic efforts and Red Cross negotiations, and it ensured that after the war, no one could accuse the United States of war crimes related to prisoner treatment. There was also a psychological warfare component. By mid-1944, American intelligence officers recognized that humanely treated POWs could be leveraged as propaganda, not through coercion, but through documentation and voluntary participation. The Office of War Information and the Psychological Warfare Branch began producing materials featuring photographs of Japanese POWs in camps, images of prisoners eating meals, playing baseball, receiving medical care, and writing letters home. These weren't staged propaganda shots with actors. They were real prisoners in real camps. These materials were incorporated into surrender leaflets dropped over Japanese positions. The message was simple: surrender doesn't mean death. It means survival. Your command has lied to you. The impact was difficult to measure in 1944, but became clearer in 1945 as surrender rates increased. Interrogations of newly captured prisoners frequently mentioned the leaflets. Some said they hadn't believed the claims about humane treatment until they experienced it themselves. Others said the leaflets had planted seeds of doubt that grew over time. But there was an unintended consequence that American planners didn't fully anticipate: the psychological devastation experienced by POWs when they realized the extent of the lies they'd been told. This wasn't just about survival versus death. It was about the complete collapse of a belief system. The Imperial Japanese military had built its power on absolute obedience backed by ideological indoctrination. Soldiers weren't just following orders. They believed in the divine mission of the emperor, the superiority of Japanese warrior spirit, and the subhuman nature of the enemy. When humane treatment shattered those beliefs, it didn't just make soldiers more likely to surrender. It made them question everything about the system they'd served. The officers who'd beaten them, the propaganda that had lied to them, the war itself. This psychological transformation was documented by camp psychiatrists and intelligence officers. Reports noted that many POWs went through stages similar to grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and sometimes acceptance. Some never reached acceptance. The American military's psychological warfare experts began studying these effects. Could humane treatment be weaponized? Could you defeat an enemy not by killing them, but by treating them so well that their entire worldview collapsed? These questions became central to post-war military psychology and the development of modern psychological operations doctrine. The Japanese POW experience became a case study taught at military institutions. The lesson: information and humane treatment could be as strategically valuable as firepower. But there was a darker element that historians later uncovered. While Japanese prisoners in the continental United States were treated according to Geneva Convention standards, the treatment of prisoners in the Pacific Theater was often inconsistent. In the heat of combat, on islands where the fighting was savage and American casualties were high, the taking of prisoners was rare. Many Japanese soldiers were killed after attempting to surrender. Others were shot while wounded. Some were never given the chance to surrender at all. This wasn't official policy. Army and Marine Corps regulations required the humane treatment of prisoners, but combat is chaos, and hatred for an enemy that fought fanatically and often refused to surrender led to widespread killing of men who might have been captured. The contrast between the Pacific Front and the prison camps stateside revealed a fundamental tension in how America waged war. The nation prided itself on humane values and respect for international law, but in the brutality of island combat, those values often evaporated. Historians estimate that for every Japanese soldier who made it to a POW camp in the United States, Dozens or hundreds were killed in circumstances where capture might have been possible. The men who did survive to reach the camps were lucky, and what they experienced once there was genuinely humane by the standards of the time. But we must hold both truths simultaneously. The treatment of Japanese POWs in American camps was remarkably humane, and it existed alongside a theater of war where quarter was rarely given and hatred ran deep. The hamburgers were real. So was the brutality. The story of Japanese POWs in American camps remains largely unknown. It's absent from most history textbooks, rarely mentioned in documentaries, overshadowed by the larger narratives of Pacific combat, atomic weapons, and occupation, but its implications are profound. First, it reveals the power of propaganda. The Japanese military convinced millions of men that surrender meant torture and death. That belief caused countless soldiers to fight to the death when they might have survived. It led to suicide charges, kamikaze attacks, and mass civilian deaths on Saipan and Okinawa. The propaganda was so effective that it continued to shape behavior even after contradictory evidence emerged. Leaflets showing well-treated POWs were dismissed as fakes. Testimonies from prisoners were considered coerced. The lie was more powerful than the truth. Second, it demonstrates how cognitive dissonance can be a weapon. When reality contradicts deeply held beliefs, the psychological stress can be devastating. For Japanese POWs, the contradiction between expected torture and actual humane treatment didn't produce gratitude, it produced existential crisis. This phenomenon has been studied extensively in the decades since. Modern psychological operations doctrine incorporates these lessons. The goal isn't just to defeat an enemy militarily, it's to undermine their ideology so completely that defeat becomes acceptable or even preferable to continued resistance. Third, it raises uncomfortable questions about honor and morality in war. Japanese soldiers were taught that death was more honorable than surrender, that survival as a POW was worse than annihilation. But after the war, who benefited from those deaths? The officers who ordered men to fight to the death often surrendered themselves. Military leaders who preached suicide attacks lived to face war crimes trials. The government that demanded absolute sacrifice collapsed in defeat. And the men who did surrender, the supposed cowards, survived to rebuild Japan. This raises a question that extends far beyond World War II. Whose interests are served by ideologies that glorify death over survival? When authority figures demand absolute sacrifice, who profits from that sacrifice? And who pays the price? Fourth, the story illustrates the limits and possibilities of humane treatment in conflict. The Geneva Conventions exist because nations recognize that even in war, certain standards should be maintained. The treatment of Japanese POWs in American camps shows those standards can be met even when fighting a fanatical enemy that doesn't reciprocate. But it also shows the limits. The camps existed far from the fighting. Guards weren't dealing with fresh combat trauma. Prisoners weren't seen as immediate threats. On the front lines, where men watched their friends die, humane treatment was much harder to maintain. The gulf between policy and practice, between the camp in Wisconsin and the battlefield in Okinawa, remains one of the enduring challenges of warfare. How do you maintain humanity in circumstances that destroy it? Finally, the story reveals something about reconciliation and alliance building. Japan and the United States went from total war to close partnership in less than a decade. That transformation required both nations to reshape their narratives about each other. For America, it meant emphasizing post-war cooperation and downplaying wartime brutality. For Japan, it meant confronting uncomfortable truths about the war and the lies told to soldiers and civilians. The experience of POWs, men who saw both sides of their enemy, became a complicating factor in that narrative reconstruction. Some former POWs became advocates for Japanese-American friendship. They'd seen American society at its most ordinary, mess halls, baseball games, medical care, and recognized that the enemy had been human all along. Others remained bitter, not at Americans, but at the Japanese leadership that had lied to them. The hamburger that shocked a starving soldier in 1944 became, in hindsight, a symbol of the profound gap between propaganda and reality. It represented not just a meal, but a revelation. The enemy wasn't monstrous. The cause wasn't holy. The sacrifice wasn't necessary. And that revelation, more than any bomb or bullet, helped ensure that the next generation of Japanese citizens would view war with skepticism rather than glory. December 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. A Japanese soldier sits before a tray of food and realizes that everything he believed was a lie. This moment repeated itself thousands of times across dozens of camps. Each time, a man confronted the gap between what he'd been taught and what he experienced. Each time, a belief system cracked a little more. The humane treatment of Japanese POWs in American camps was simultaneously an act of legal compliance, strategic calculation, and basic human decency. It saved lives. It produced intelligence. It created propaganda that encouraged surrender. And it devastated the psychological foundations of Japanese military ideology. But it also created a generation of men who carried profound guilt and confusion for the rest of their lives. Men who'd survived when honor demanded they die. Men who'd been treated well by an enemy they'd been taught to hate. Men who returned home to a society that saw them as cowards rather than survivors. The most powerful weapon in World War II wasn't the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb ended the war, but it didn't change minds. It forced surrender through destruction. The hamburger, the hot shower, the medical care, the absence of torture changed minds. It destroyed the ideological foundation that made fanatical resistance possible. It revealed propaganda as lies and authority as corrupt. It turned true believers into skeptics. In the decades after the war, as historians studied psychological warfare and propaganda, the Japanese POW experience became a case study. How do you defeat an enemy's will to fight? Not just by killing them, but by making them question why they're fighting in the first place. The answer, it turned out, was simpler than anyone expected. Treat them like human beings. Give them what their own system denied them. Show them that the enemy isn't monstrous, and watch as the cognitive dissonance tears their ideology apart from the inside. This wasn't a mercy. It was a weapon wielded with food and shelter and basic human dignity, a weapon that struck not at the body, but at the mind. The soldiers who'd expected torture and received hamburgers instead carried that contradiction for the rest of their lives. Some made peace with it, others never did. But all of them understood, in the end, that the war they'd been told they were fighting was not the war that actually existed. And that understanding, that devastating, irreversible understanding, may have been the most effective psychological operation in military history. The Japanese government tried to hide what happened in American POW camps because they knew the truth was dangerous. Not dangerous to the Americans, dangerous to the narrative that had sustained Japanese militarism. If soldiers learned that surrender meant life rather than death, that the enemy was humane rather than barbaric, that authority had lied rather than protected, what then? How do you maintain a system built on absolute obedience when the foundation of that obedience is revealed as fiction? You can't. The system collapses. And in the rubble, survivors are left to piece together new beliefs from the fragments of old lies. The meal that broke an army wasn't served on a battlefield. It was served on a metal tray in a heated mess hall in Wisconsin, and its effects rippled through decades, shaping how we understand propaganda, psychological warfare, and the power of humane treatment in the midst of total war. The hamburgers were real. The kindness was real. And the devastation they caused to Japanese military ideology was as complete as any bombardment. That's the story no one tells, the story of how America won a secret war not with violence, but with decency, and how that decency became the most devastating weapon of all.